evening, and thank you for the applause. As you just heard, I work for the United Nations, and part of my job is to give presentations to student groups. And now these students, they come from all over the world, from different continents, countries, cultures, and so on. And sometimes the questions they ask, they're related to the region they come from. So students from the Middle East sometimes ask about how to bring peace and stability to their societies. Or I have students from small islands who ask about climate change and the rising sea levels and how this will affect their homes and their islands. But what strikes me is that more often these students who come from all over the world have very similar questions and very similar concerns, actually. So they worry about, for example, the rising inequality in their societies. For example, that a handful of rich men control half of the planet's wealth. Or terrorism, or other global trends like water scarcity, food insecurity, and so on. And of course, then they ask, what is the UN doing to solve all of these problems? And I found that the expectations that students have of the UN, they vary quite a bit. So one extreme is that they have too high expectations and consequently feel disappointed. So they might ask, why has the UN not solved the Syria problem, the Syria crisis, in all these years? And I then often answer, well, I wish the UN had a magic wand with which it could easily solve all problems, but unfortunately it doesn't have such a magic wand. But it consists of countries, of member states, and if these states strongly disagree on certain issues, then it's just very, very difficult to solve these issues. On the other extreme, there are students who, I think, underestimate what the UN can achieve. Maybe because the news they hear tends to focus on where the organization does not succeed. But if you look at the numbers, then I think its value is very evident. For example, it provides food to 80 million people in 80 countries. It vaccinates 45% of all children worldwide. It provides assistance to over 65 million people who are fleeing wars, persecution, famine, and so on. So, and to get back to this question, what is the UN doing? There's many things, of course. There's many agencies, there's many programs. What I talk about are the Sustainable Development Goals. And can I see a quick show of hands? Who has heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? Some of you, okay. Many of you will have a lot to learn today, so that's good. Here they are 17. Now, I'm not going to go through them individually, because they're quite a lot. But you can see the areas that they focus on here. Now, these goals were agreed on in the year 2015 by all UN member states to be achieved by the year 2030. And I will say that they're part of a broader agenda, the so-called 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it includes many targets on how we might achieve these goals. They include indicators on how we can track progress towards these goals. But the point that I just want to make now is they focus both on the consequences of these disturbing trends that I mentioned, like water scarcity, food insecurity, conflicts, but also on the root causes. So that they both try to address the consequences, but also the root causes, and thus try to prevent crises. For example, they won't be able to solve all conflicts, but if we get these right, they can prevent conflicts in the future. One way to summarize this agenda is to say that these SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, are part of a plan of action to end poverty, protect the planet, promote prosperity, and ensure peace for all. Now, can I see a quick show of hands? Who thinks this sounds very ambitious? That's what I thought. I also think it sounds very ambitious, but we actually have grounds for optimism because we had these so-called Millennium Development Goals. And can I see another quick show of hands? Who has heard of these Millennium Development Goals? A couple of you, okay, very good. Now, these were a set of 8 anti-poverty goals that ran from the year 2000 until the year 2015. And though we didn't achieve all of the goals, they were very successful. For example, the number of children who died before their 5th birthday in the year 1990 was 12 million. That's per year. In the year 2015, this number is 6 million. Of course, it's still much too high. It's clearly 6 million too many. But we saw that by really focusing our attention on certain problems, by rallying around countries, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, business, and so on, we can really achieve a lot. So this model of setting goals in the area of development, that really worked well. So now we came up with member states came up with the so-called Sustainable Development Goals. But these are not just another set of goals. These are something very different from anything we've had before in the field of development, and I'll explain why. One is they integrate the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of development. So when we devise policy, they guide countries to try and balance out these elements. Has anyone heard of the Rio Plus 20 conference? Some of you. This is a conference that took place in 2012, and at this conference, member states decided to create these goals. I like to show this slide because this logo nicely visualizes these three dimensions of sustainable development. You have the red person there, which stands for the social side. You have the blue steps, which stands for economic progress. And you have the green leaf, which stands for the environment. Some people say it looks like a shark eating a drowning person. But it's not a shark, it's sustainable development. Another thing is these goals are holistic, and that means the three main pillars of the UN's work are human rights, peace and security, and sustainable development. And this is the first time we have an agenda like this and goals that kind of wrap all of these elements into one. So that's also something which is relatively new. These goals were also negotiated through a very inclusive process. So all member states of the UN, they got together for over 1 year. They discussed, negotiated what goals should be part of this agenda, and they also opened channels for many stakeholders, so for nonprofit organizations, NGOs, other civil society groups, scientists, academia, and so on, and they all contribute to these discussions and to these negotiations. And we feel that they really, both the stakeholders and member states, have a very strong sense of ownership for these goals because they actually negotiated them. The whole process was also very transparent. So all of these discussions were live streamed on UN Web TV, and they're still available. They're on archive. Now, we will say not every one of these sessions was a cliffhanger, and you're probably not going to start binge watching hours and hours of recordings of intergovernmental negotiations, but the transparency was exemplary. Also, these goals are what we call universal, which means they are for all countries to achieve. So it's not a classical development agenda where you have certain goals and targets for developing countries to achieve, but these are goals for all countries to achieve. And the idea is that we will only be able to reach this objective of achieving the goals and reaching sustainable development if every country plays its part and takes action. And if you think of these 17 areas that the goals cover, I don't think there's any country that can say, we can lean back and there's nothing to do in any of these areas, because there's something to do in every country. Also, we have a strong review mechanism, which we didn't have for these previous goals. We have the so-called high-level political forum on sustainable development, which is a forum where once a year, countries and stakeholders, again, NGOs, private sector, businesses, and so on, academia, come together in New York to discuss how is the progress going towards these goals? How are we doing? What are the big obstacles? How can we remove them? What are the lessons we learned? And so on. So it's really a global peer learning exercise where countries discuss how we can do better in achieving these goals. And finally, I want to mention the overall vision of this agenda, which is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is leave no one behind. So there's a very strong focus on really reaching those who are furthest behind first and those who are most marginalized. So there's a strong emphasis on this. Now, finally, my key messages in the end. One is the Sustainable Development Goals are a promise made to you. Now, people, or in the public, when they hear about UN global goals, they often think of these in terms of an agreement between the UN and countries. But they should really be seen as a commitment by your leaders to you. So they're really a promise that decision makers make to the public, to the people who will stand to benefit if these goals are realized. So that's the kind of relations that you should look at these goals. And also this follows, the second point follows from that, which is hold your leaders responsible and hold them to this promise of the goals. And it's member states, it's governments who lead on this agenda. They drive it forward. But I think we will not be able to achieve it if it's only a top-down process. So we really have to make it a bottom-up process as well. In other words, have the public, have individuals, have stakeholders who have a stake in these goals also promote the goals and get engaged and hold their leaders to this promise. So that's my call for action. Please get engaged, become informed, because that's also the basis of promoting the goals. Spread the word and hold your leaders to this promise. And I mentioned earlier the UN does not have a magic wand. I think we're working on one. But until we have it, I think you'd be surprised how much we can achieve if everybody rallies around certain goals. And finally, I hope that I'll be invited back here in 2030 to talk to you about how we achieved all of these goals. Thank you.